Okay, we're going to take a step backward. We've talked about the prosperity of the 1920s. Now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges that we faced coming out of World War One. The decade of the 1920s opened with the difficult task of adjusting to peace. Disillusioned by the war, Americans returned to their traditional policy of isolationism in foreign affairs, refusing to become involved in other nations' disputes or problems. The government stopped its wartime spending, and soldiers returned home from war looking for jobs. Factories closed to convert from military to civilian production. Farmers lost their markets in Europe. These factors led to a temporary economic recession in the United States lasting from 1919 to 1921. Here's your essential question. What difficulties did Americans have in adjusting to peace after the war? In just a second, when I flip the slide, there's going to be a short video that kind of gives you an overview of what we're going to be talking about. In your notes, there are 3 questions that you need to answer that go along with this video, and then we'll pick back up with the PowerPoint.
At the end of the war, a number of people become obsessed with purging the country of radicals.
You had this sort of explosion of pure American patriotism in 1919. You have the crackdown on the communists and the first real major American Red Scare in 1919. You have a crackdown on a lot of unions. You have a number of spectacularly violent strikes and strike breaking in that year. And all of this is usually attributed to the intensity of the pro-war propaganda campaign, which sort of had no place to go once the war, which was very brief, was over.
And on top of this, there was the growing power of the Socialist Party in America, which had remarkable gains between 1910 and 1917. The Socialist Party won many, many state and local elections. And so you had this sense that there was a relationship between foreignness, between immigration, and between these radical political ideas of anarchism, socialism, and ultimately communism.
Keep in mind, of course, that this is only 2 years after the Russian Revolution, and the Bolshevik menace of Russia was still very fresh in everyone's minds as a new force in the world. But the Red Scare after World War I did not have very much to do with a fear of the military aims of the Soviet Union. It was much more a fear of domestic subversion and a series of bombings, in fact, that occurred in the United States, in Washington, on Wall Street, and elsewhere, terrified Americans. Attorney General Palmer and his ambitious assistant, J. Edgar Hoover, orchestrate a series of raids on alleged radical centers, arresting more than 6,000 people.
Without either search warrants or arrest warrants, they had held them in detention for long periods of time without bringing charges against them. They had especially singled out a lot of immigrants, a lot of aliens. The Supreme Court, which in this period was not the most progressive of the courts, at times drew the line or attempted to somewhat moderate this kind of hysteria.
It was really only in some cases that arose out of the Espionage Act in the First World War that the Supreme Court announced that the clear and present danger standard was applicable to freedom of speech. But a point I want to make here is that people went to jail for saying things in the First World War that nobody would have even thought it possible to convict people in the Second World War, during the Korean War, the Vietnam War, of saying those kinds of things. Opposition to the government, opposition to the war, and so on.
So, those professors talked a little bit about each of the topics that we're going to cover. The first is the first Red Scare. The end of World War I brought new fears to many Americans of communists, anarchists, and immigrants. Russia had been ill-prepared for World War I. In 1917, strikes in cities and soldiers' mutinies had led to an overthrow of their czar. Later that year, communist revolutionaries led by Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks had seized power. They started a new communist regime in Russia, now being called the Soviet Union. Communists threatened to spread their revolution to other countries in Europe, especially Germany and Hungary. When a wave of strikes also hit the United States in 1919, many Americans feared this was the start of their own communist revolution, and so this first Red Scare created an atmosphere of panic. The Palmer Raids. In January 1919, an Italian anarchist set off a bomb outside the home of Attorney General Mitchell Palmer. The bombing was one in a series of attacks that day on judges, politicians, and law enforcement officials in 8 American cities, including Cleveland and New York. The nation demanded that action be taken immediately. This convinced Palmer that a radical plot to overthrow the U.S. government was underway, and in January of 1920, Palmer ordered the roundup of more than 4,000 suspects in several cities without warrants. His assistant, J. Edgar Hoover, directed the raids, and Palmer arrested men he accused of plotting to overthrow the government. Most of these men were later released, but eventually 600 of them were actually deported. You can see the political cartoon. Obviously, you can see Palmer with his police force rounding up anyone and everyone. Again, typically communists, anarchists, and immigrants were who he was targeting. Sacco and Vanzetti. The anti-communist hysteria affected immigrants as well. 2 Italian immigrants, Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, were convicted of committing a murder during a robbery. The robbery, they said, was allegedly committed to obtain funds for an anarchist revolution. Pressure to release them came from around the world. Many Americans feared looking weak to the rest of the world if they let them go. So although the evidence was insufficient to convict them, the judges were extremely partial. Both Sacco and Vanzetti were found guilty. They were executed in 1927, but supporters of Sacco and Vanzetti's innocence believe their conviction was due to their anarchist views, despite jurors who insisted that anarchism played no part in their decision. Nativism and racism were both on the rise. The Red Scare, anarchist bombings, and the Sacco and Vanzetti trial contributed to the rise of nativism. Remember, that's a dislike of foreigners. Nativists believed that white Protestant Americans were superior to everyone else. And we'll talk about in a little bit, these attitudes led to new restrictions on immigration. Migration of African Americans, that Great Migration from the South to northern cities, also led to increased racial tensions. The Ku Klux Klan, which had been dead for decades, found a new life in 1915. Klan members were hostile to immigrants, Catholics, Jews, African Americans. Major race riots broke out after the war in many American cities. The worst riot happened in Chicago, where 38 people were killed. The lynching of African Americans also continued, as well as deep segregation in the South.